Today we're going to continue on with the progress of Reconstruction. Please have out your progress of Reconstruction timeline from 1865 to 1877. Also, please keep note of any questions that you may have about Reconstruction. All right, so as you can see, just as a quick refresher, from April to December 1865, we had the phase of presidential Reconstruction. So that was when the Civil War ended in April. Then Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president. We're going to see the president taking control over Reconstruction and Reconstruction efforts, and he will use part of Lincoln's plan, but he'll also use his own plan where he will be personally pardoning former white Southerners. In addition, though, there's going to be the 13th Amendment that is ratified in December of 1865 to end slavery once and for all. However, although the 13th Amendment is key, it is unfortunately not going to be enough to protect the newly freed slaves. Congress is going to struggle to take the lead in the Reconstruction efforts, largely because Andrew Johnson was failing so badly and Johnson wasn't radical enough. And again, it's going to be radical Republicans who are controlling Congress, but really by our standards today, there was not really anything radical about them. So by 1866, they have control, and there's going to be a conversation that emerges as to who is a citizen, who actually has citizenship in the United States. So there are 4 million freed people. Are they citizens? Are they not? What are we going to do essentially with so many people who have now come into the system? And we're going to have Congress pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, this is actually the first time that Congress passed a law relating to civil rights. And what it is going to do is define a citizenship define a citizen as anyone who was born in the United States up to this point. Before this, citizenship was decided by your states. So being born here as equaling citizenship was a new concept. The Democrats were against this, and actually some Republicans were too, and the only way this ended up getting passed was that moderate Republicans got on board with this. However, Johnson does veto it, but Congress is actually going to be able to override the veto. And this really comes into play as we see Congress is going to go farther towards the Republican Party. So there were radical Republicans. You read about Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens. They had different ideas as leaders of Congress of what citizenship and what the Civil Rights Bill should look like. Ultimately, though, these radical Republicans are going to fight for the rights for freedmen. But just something to keep in mind, even the radical Republicans did not agree as to what those rights would look like and what the extent of those rights would be. The problem with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was also that it could have been overridden by the Supreme Court, or it could have been repealed in a later act of Congress, because it actually does specifically go against the Dred Scott case. The solution, of course, is if you put it in the Constitution, it can never go away. It can't be unconstitutional. So then we're going to have the debate of passing the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment will be passed then to make the pieces of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 completely constitutional. And the 14th Amendment is also going to become the key issue in the congressional elections of 1866. So please follow along with your handout here for the text, or the abbreviated text of the 14th Amendment. So the first thing it does is it makes Black citizens of the United States, because what it does is define citizenship as someone who was born and naturalized in the United States. The next piece that it does, it's called the Equal Protection Clause. It says all citizens have all rights in all states. So what this really means is it reiterates that rights cannot be taken from you. It says specifically life, liberty, property without due process of law. So it is essentially reiterating that due process clause. And we're also going to be seeing the next piece, which is really to change the Southern electorate. So it says if any proportion or percentage of citizens is not allowed to vote, the state loses that percentage of its representatives in the House of Representatives. So in other words, it gives the South a choice. It says either give blacks the right to vote or lose seats in the House of Representatives. Now, some radicals actually wanted a more specific guarantee of universal male suffrage, but they realized that this actually would have maybe led to defeat in the North of the 14th Amendment, since in the North, only actually a few states allowed blacks the right to vote. So then you'll see the next piece here, anyone who participated in or supported the rebellion, fought for or helped the South in the Civil War, cannot vote or hold office until pardoned by 2/3 of each House of Congress. All right, so what this is essentially doing is taking the power back from Andrew Johnson and taking power back from the president, and it says that only Congress can forgive those who had been Confederates. So this is a reversal of Johnson's plan to essentially pardon all Confederates. And then you're going to see the next piece, the final piece, that says Confederate or Southern war debts will never be paid, but the Union debt will be paid in full. So what this is saying is it is to dissuade people from ever joining the rebellion again. Essentially, tax dollars will go to pay Union bills, but the Union will not help pay Confederate bills. So if you were stupid and you invested all of your life saving in the Confederacy, sorry, you're out of luck. You're never going to see that money again. So what Andrew Johnson is going to do is he's actually going to go out and campaign. And he is going to go out and actually campaign against the 14th Amendment. So in the summer and the fall of 1866, he's going to go for something, he called it the Swing Around the Circle campaign. It was basically a circuitous route on a speaking tour, and he drew massive, massive crowds and took every opportunity to get out there and trash the 14th Amendment. When people came to see the president, they expected to actually see him, but he was plagued with a real lack of formal education. He was always accused of being an alcoholic. He probably was. He did have his supporters, but he did have his opponents too. But he went out basically and he tried to rally the crowds, and his supporters saw him, or excuse me, the people coming to the rally saw him, and they said, we don't like this. And they ended up voting the opposite. So they ended up voting for Republicans and radical Republicans in overwhelming numbers, more than ever before. And this is then going to backfire on Andrew Johnson. And actually right here he is in the Swing Around the Circle campaign. This is one of the banquets that they held in his honor. So also just to note, even though the 14th Amendment is passed in 1866, it's not actually going to be ratified until 1868. Due to Johnson's campaign, 10 states actually listened to him, southern states, and didn't actually ratify it. The only southern state that actually did ratify it was Tennessee, and Johnson was from Tennessee, so not a lot of love from his home state. But like I was saying, people see him, they don't like it, and they go the opposite. We're going to then have the official beginning, the clear beginning in 1867, as you see there on your timeline, of congressional Reconstruction. And the first thing that they're going to do is Congress is going to declare military Reconstruction. So basically, they look around, meaning Congress, and they say, okay, we don't see any states down here. These states are going to be divided from 10 states into 5 military districts. and each one is going to be run by a general of the army. Then there's going to be basically sort of martial law, and that will be continued until each state rewrites their constitution and ratifies the 13th Amendment. And specifically, the states' constitutions had to say that no one who had taken part in the rebellion could hold office, and they had to specifically say that African American males could have the right to vote. So what the result is a dramatic shift in Southern social order. Almost all white males in the South are going to be disenfranchised. So here is a picture of these military reconstruction zones. As you can see, they are made into districts: military district 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Tennessee wasn't actually a district. They came immediately really back into the Union. They just signed up. They're like, yep, we'll do it, whatever it takes. All right. We're also going to see then the beginnings of the Reconstruction governments. So these are going to be run by Republicans, and they're going to have their base of power in freedmen's, carpetbaggers, and scalawags, since most white males of the South couldn't vote or hold office. So at this time, I'd like you to take out your handout that says African Americans in Reconstruction from the 14th Amendment to Jim Crow, and I want you to take a minute and just read the beginning, read on the first page through where through scalawags. So stop when it says after, stop right before it says after 1876, okay? So you should get a clearer idea then of what the basis of the power is going to be from these three groups. The carpetbaggers are going to be white Northerners who moved to the South after the war. Carpetbagger became a very derogatory word. The reality is most were middle class with good intentions who didn't come to victimize and take advantage of Southerners, actually wanted to help the South. Many were teachers and ministers or people who liked the weather, former Union soldiers, but they were hated because they had the right to vote. The next group, as you can see, are the scalawags. Sorry, I am going out of our order, so I started with carpetbaggers. Then we'll go to scalawags. These were considered the worst of the lot, according to Southerners. They were the ones who had not supported the war. They were the 2% of the Southerners who were pro-Union, but they too had the right to vote. It's going to be the carpetbaggers and the scalawags who form the basis of the Reconstruction governments in terms of office holders. And then the freedmen, of course, the former slaves who could now vote and hold office, they're the largest of the group. But however, due to the fact that most of them did not have an education or experience to be office holders, they're going to make up just the largest majority of voters. And just fun fact, a scalawag is also the name for a baby calf. So the next time you're on the farm and you see a baby calf, you can correctly refer to it as a scalawag. You're welcome. All right, so we're not done though with Johnson. Even though Congress has essentially taken over the power, Johnson's not out of the picture because he is still the commander-in-chief of the army, and he could appoint generals who were sympathetic to the South. And there were actually quite a few generals who were sympathetic to the South. They'd all gone to West Point together, and we're going to see that not everyone's going to get on board. But Edwin Stanton, who had been Lincoln Secretary of War, he was right now the Secretary of War. He also had served in Lincoln's cabinet. He was an ally to the radical Republicans. He was an interesting guy. He had a pretty quick temper, very short-fused, kind of actually like William Lloyd Garrison in some ways. But he'd been appointed by Lincoln in 1862 and honestly was one of the main reasons that the North had won the war. He was a great administrator. He was so disagreeable, though, that he even talked back to Abraham Lincoln. I know, can you believe it? Like, he's got a lot of nerve. Talked back to Abe, but he did. They were basically, like, sometimes they were like two angry pit bulls going at each other, just arguing over what the war strategy was going to be. But Johnson wanted generals who would be easy on the South, and he basically accused Stanton of wanting big meanies. And that's true. Stanton did want meanies. But he wanted meanies in order to allow for blacks to have some chance of getting some sort of civil rights. So what Congress did was they realized that Johnson wanted Edwin Stanton out. So they passed the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, what this says was that Stanton could not get fired by the president without the consent of the Senate. And at this point, they were feeling very pleased with themselves. They're like, we've done it. But they didn't do it. Johnson fired Stanton anyway. Stanton got so upset that he actually barricaded himself in his office and cooked his own meals for days until he was finally forced to come out. He was that angry that he had been fired. But the question was, did Andrew Johnson break the law? So just in terms of chronology again of how it went, Stanton had been serving under Lincoln. Lincoln dies. Johnson becomes president. Stanton stays on in the cabinet. He is the Secretary of War. Congress then passes the law saying that no one can get fired without the consent of the Senate. And then Johnson fires him anyway. So the thing is, the real million-dollar question was, well, was what Congress did, was that a constitutional law to begin with? So Johnson had, though, at this moment apparently broken the law. And then in early of 1868, the House of Representatives voted articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. And just as a reminder, you all know, impeachment, the laying of formal charges against the member of an executive or judicial branch, voted on by the House, doesn't mean you're guilty. What it means is you have to go up against the Senate for a trial. And if you are found guilty by the Senate, then you will be convicted and removed from office. And then, of course, you can still face civil charges. Just as a little reminder here, Nixon was not impeached. He resigned. Clinton was impeached for perjury, but he was not convicted. In early of 1868, the House of Representatives voted on articles of impeachment against Johnson. Then he is going to be put on trial before the Senate, where he narrowly avoided conviction by one vote. Technically, he had not actually violated the law because he had not appointed Stanton, Lincoln had, so he was able to deny committing any crime since it wasn't his actual appointment. Also, the problem was it wasn't actually a constitutional law. The Tenure of Office Act later is going to go before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that, hey, actually the cabinet, they only have to be confirmed by the Senate, but you don't have to have any sort of thing to fire them. That had always been at will by the president. And if you remember, it was George Washington who came up with the whole idea of the cabinet. So basically what we're going to have is motives and a lot of political motivations. The Republicans wanted Plan B as a president. They actually wanted Ulysses S. Grant to become president. He, however, didn't actually know if he was a Democrat or Republican yet at this time. So the next president, the next person who was in line to be president was President pro tempore of the Senate, who was a radical Republican named Benjamin Wade. So they were, like I said, one vote away from a two-thirds majority on the 11 articles of impeachment that they brought against Johnson, and 7 voted not guilty, 1 vote short. So he's going to be impeached but not convicted, And it is really important because basically what we did in that moment was avoid a dangerous precedent. and that was a dangerous precedent for removal of any president who could not command a majority in the House on an important issue. If we had just continued down this path, it would mean that basically if any time a president had political opposition, whether or not he actually had broken the law, he would have been removed, convicted from office. So, 1868. So in 1868, it's a presidential election year, and which party is going to capture General Grant was the big question, and he decided that he was a Republican. The Democrats put forth a candidate. His name was Horatio Seymour, but Grant wins the election. He was fairly young, only 46 when he became president, but he was a very bad president. First is he was real dumb. He was dumber than a box of rocks. Second, he was not a very good judge of character. He was actually extremely honest, and which is a good thing, but he expected that everyone else was honest too. He was very, very trusting, way too trusting, and he attracted dishonest friends and people who wanted to take advantage of him. He also didn't really see the presidency as a job, but as a reward for winning the Civil War. Which, I mean, I understand the temptation, like it's pretty awesome, you won the Civil War, but he wasn't exactly up to the task. So he's going to be way in over his head. He'd actually failed as a young man at a lot of different things, including working as a clerk for his brother-in-law before he was discovered as he's actually really good at this military stuff. But the Grant administration is actually going to be the biggest time of corruption in U.S. history. But weirdly, he was probably the only honest person in his administration. Again, like I said, just a lot of bad people around him because he had no judge of character. So he's going to get into office and he's going to be faced with military reconstruction. And at this point, the states start to ratify the 14th Amendment, and in the South, though, about 98% of the men couldn't vote because they had aided in the rebellion. Reconstruction governments had a very bad reputation, and one accusation that was made was that they were corrupt. They were. However, we do also have to look at the larger context here, that the Grant administration was incredibly corrupt. He was the only honest one, but the northern state governments were also corrupt as well. This is going to be we're going to be talking in a few classes about the cycles of reform and corruption again. This was actually one of the biggest and most extensive times of corruption in history on every level. So we can't blame all of it on the Reconstruction governments. There's nothing really unique bringing corruption to the South because it was pretty much over the entire United States. So some of the other things that go on during these Reconstruction governments, specifically in the South, is railroads. And much of the railroad track in the South is rebuilt under the Reconstruction governments. Another issue was education. There was a high priority placed on public education in the South and huge strides in Southern public education. This, of course, is a huge issue for freedmen. It's not going to be easy for the freedmen to actually get to school and be able to get an education, but there is a priority in making education accessible. Unfortunately, it's not going to be for long. There's also going to be the role of the media. The media attention is going to be a big deal that helps undermine these Reconstruction governments. Basically, the media sells the image to the North that there are these horrible, corrupt governments in the South. And while that's true, there were also horrible, corrupt governments in the North. One of the other big issues at this time was the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. So this group was founded in the late 1860s, and it started as a Confederate veterans organization. But really what it turned into was systematic terrorism against people who supported Reconstruction governments. They would dress up in these dumb white robes and pretend they were dead Confederate soldiers. Look at how cool they look in their stupid white robes. All right, so they would terrorize basically African Americans, and unfortunately at this time African Americans were not allowed to have guns anywhere in the country. Those were basically state laws taking away and stripping away and chipping away at their Second Amendment right. So we're going to have essentially a homegrown terrorist group terrorizing African American freedmen from trying to vote, trying to have the franchise, trying to participate in the new government. They were dedicated to restoring the quote-unquote old social order. By the early 1870s, there's going to be a movement to have the pre-war elite come back into power. Now, these were called the Redeemers. They were not the Klan. They were not so crude as the Klan, but they were a group of men who wanted to get back into power, and they called themselves the Redeemers. They were Democrats. So the KKK violence is separate from the Redeemers, although sometimes some Redeemer candidates would support KKK violence. However, you are going to have essentially former Confederates trying to get back into power. And at the same time, the KKK terrorism continued on, and it was so horrible that federal legislation was passed where the feds could actually use the army to stop the KKK. And in those places, the Klan actually did start to decline. So another example of the need to reform and to protect African Americans was with the passage then of the 15th Amendment. So remember that the 14th Amendment, it clearly lays out that blacks are made citizens of the United States. And you might think that, gee, if you're a citizen, you have the right to vote, but didn't actually use the word vote. So it was, remember, state constitutions that had been granting African American men the franchise in order to come back into the Union. But now there is going to be the 15th Amendment put forth by the radical Republicans, hoping that it would prevent state legislatures from trying to disenfranchise freedmen in the future. This, of course, isn't going to actually, once again, be effective, but it says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, the most immediate effect ended up being the enfranchisement of northern black citizens. Since the South had already franchised had franchised black men in their state constitutions, most northern governments actually had not. And so the 15th Amendment, the biggest impact is actually going to be in the North. It basically takes the 14th Amendment a step further by explicitly adding, yes, freedmen have the right to vote. Of course, unfortunately, this doesn't include women. The suffragists were very upset by this, but it did not apply to women, although it clearly should have. All right. So the early phases then of Reconstruction, just a little bit of a summary. We have the 14th and 15th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment explains citizenship. The 15th Amendment says essentially who cannot be denied the right to vote. But it doesn't create what's called a positive right to vote. It doesn't, there's a difference between saying who can't be denied versus that you have it. So the other thing that is going to go on in these early phases of Reconstruction is that states are going to find ways to disenfranchise blacks without using race as the reason. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more next class, but that's going to be with things like the poll tax, the grandfather clause, and literary tests. So if you want to vote, you have to be able to do X, Y, and Z. In addition, despite the fact that the 14th Amendment said that anyone who participated or supported in the rebellion, if you didn't allow your citizens the right to vote, the state would lose that percentage of its representatives. It never actually happen. It never actually was enforced. So there was no rule really to back it up. And then finally, Johnson is going to continually undermine the Reconstruction effort, specifically with the 14th Amendment. This is going to weaken the power of the presidency. It's not good form for the president to go out and campaign the way Johnson did against Reconstruction and against civil rights. And then he is going to really help ensure another century of racial oppression due to the fact that he just really could not get on board Reconstruction. So by the end of 1876, we were actually at the end of Grant's second term. Only 3 of the former Confederate states had not been redeemed, meaning that they'd had those redeemer governments. Those were the states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. So that means basically they are they still had Republican governments. So by the election of 1876, Grant had actually indicated that he wanted to run for a 3rd term. There was no term limit yet in our Constitution. But his administration was so corrupt that the Republicans decided, no, this is way too much. So the Republican Party splits into different groupings. There were the group of Republicans called the half-breed Republicans who wanted some reform for the South. There were the stalwart Republicans who didn't want any reform. And basically those candidates are going to split each other out, cancel each other out, and ultimately the Republicans are going to nominate the Republican governor of Ohio named Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes was the perfect Republican poster boy. He'd been a general in the Civil War, and this was a really big issue and a tactic used by Republicans. Basically, the strategy is called waving the bloody shirt. It reminded the American people that the winners were the Republicans and that the traitors were all Democrats. And so by bringing his war effort into the narrative, it helped people remember who the quote-unquote good guy was. Hayes was actually pretty clean. He had some integrity. He ran against a man named Tilden, who was the Democrat. Now, Tilden is actually going to win a majority in the popular and electoral votes, but he missed the majority in the Electoral College by 1 vote. He received 184 votes, but he needed 185 to win. So, where are these missing electoral votes? Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. The Redeemers had won the elections in the state election, but in the interlude, the ones who were still in power were the non-Redeemer governments, and they were the ones who sent the votes in for Hayes. So essentially, we're going to have another contested election. Both sides are going to accuse each other of corruption, and for the second time in U.S. history, the person with the more popular votes loses. And the third time, this is the third time our election needed to be decided in the House of Representatives. So the House has to decide whose votes were valid. They set up a committee. Who went on it was very strange, very bizarre. But the key takeaway here was contested election settled by the House, but also that Reconstruction is coming to an end. The one thing that helps it come to the end is the short attention spans of the American people. The personalities that drove Reconstruction had started to die out or resign from Congress. And then another factor is that Ulysses S. Grant, that amoeba of a president, will no longer be president. So this is now how more and more Redeemers are going to start to come into power. Again, it was in 1872 that we're going to have an increasing number of pardons and white Southern and increasing number of states come back into the Union, which meant that white Southern men could vote again. So in order for Hayes to become president, there actually was a compromise struck. This is known as the corrupt bargain or the Compromise of 1877. Essentially, Hayes is going to be rewarded becoming the next president. The Republicans are going to make this bargain because they want to keep the power of the presidency. And in return, there will be continued funds for money for reconstructing Southern infrastructure and the railroad in the South to help the South industrialize and fix what had been hurt. In addition, Hayes had to appoint a Southern Democrat to the cabinet, which is pretty much just a symbolic gesture. But most importantly, he had to remove troops from the South, and there would be no more interference with the affairs of newly freed people. So the Republicans right now are going to abandon their commitment to freedmen. The Republicans say, okay, no problem. This is a really corrupt, very shameful bargain. As you can see here, the Reconstruction governments were coming back into the Union, but we still had, so like Louisiana, still Florida, we still had to get some more states back into the Union. But regardless, there had been a strong military presence. So in sum, this was a pretty shameful, corrupt sellout. It abandoned the cause of civil rights. And because there isn't going to be any military reinforcement, blacks are going to lose the right that they were guaranteed, that they had been granted in the Constitution. And we're now, from 1876 on, going to see gradual encroachments on their liberties for the next 20 to 25 years. This is from 1876 on. We're going to have the onset of the Jim Crow system. 1877, not technically 1877. So the Jim Crow system is going to be that separate but equal system that I'm sure you guys have heard that phrase before. It is different than the black codes. We're going to be talking more about it next class. But this is going to include things like no right to bear arms, no right to vote. So you can see, please refer to your handout on this. I have begin back at after 1876, the Redeemer governments take power, and the Jim Crow system. And then finally, just the thought I want to leave you with is basically, even though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were in the Constitution, they still are in the Constitution, they are no longer going to be enforced. So just as a note, remember, our constitutional rights are really only as enforceable as we make them. All right, and that's where we're going to end for today. Thank you for your patience.